Chapter 1 of Breaking the Outer Ring, Marine Landings in the Marshall Islands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Breaking the Outer Ring, Marine Landings in the Marshall Islands by John C. Chapin. By the beginning of 1944, United States Marine Forces had already made a dramatic start on the conquest of areas overrun by the Japanese early in World War II. Successful American assaults in the Southwest Pacific, beginning with Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands in August 1942, and the Central Pacific at Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, were crucial campaigns to mark the turn of the Japanese floodtide of conquest. The time had now come to take one more decisive step, assault of the islands held by Japan before 1941. These strategic islands, mandated to the Japanese by the League of Nations after World War I, were a source of mystery and speculation. Outsiders were barred, illegal fortifications were presumed, yet any central Pacific drive toward Japan's inner defense ring had to confront these unknowns. The obvious target to begin with was the Marshall Islands. As early as 1921, a Marine planning officer had pinpointed their geographic significance. Planning the attack. In May 1943, the combined chiefs of staff decided to seize them. This difficult assignment fell to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who bore the impressive titles of Commander-in-Chief Pacific and Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas, CINCPAC, CINCPOA, based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. He turned to four very capable men who would carry out the actual operation. Three admirals who were experts in amphibious landings, fast carrier strikes, and shore bombardment, and Major General Holland M. Smith, who was the commanding general of the Marines' 5 Amphibious Corps and now also would be commanding general, Expeditionary Troops. It was he who would command the troops once they got ashore. Original cautious plans for stepping stone attacks starting in the eastern Marshalls were modified, and the daring decision was made to knife through the edges and strike directly at Kwajalein Atoll in the heart of the Marshalls' cluster of 32 atolls, more than 1,000 islands, and 867 reefs. Kwajalein is the largest atoll in the world, 60 miles long and 20 miles wide, a semi-enclosed series of 80 reefs and islets around a huge lagoon of some 800 square miles. Located 620 miles northwest of Tarawa and 2,415 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, its capture would have far-reaching strategic significance in that it would break the outer ring of Japanese Pacific defense lines. Within the atoll itself there were two objectives, Roy and Namur, a pair of connected islands shaped like weights on a 4-mile barbell in the north end, and crescent-shaped Kwajalein Island at the south end. The 4th Marine Division under Major General Harry Schmidt was to assault Roy Namur, and the Army 7th Infantry Division under Major General Charles H. Corlett would attack Kwajalein. After these islands were taken, there was one more objective in the Marshalls, Eniwetok Atoll. This was targeted for attack some 3 months later by a task force comprised of the 22nd Marine Regiment, called in the Corps the 22nd Marines, and most of the Army's 106th Infantry Regiment. Brigadier General Thomas E. Watson, USMC, would be in command. As a preliminary to these priority operations, the occupation of another atoll in the eastern Marshalls was planned. This objective was Majuro, which would serve as an advanced air and naval base and safeguard supply lines to Kwajalein 220 miles to the northwest. Because it was believed to be very lightly defended, only the Marine 5 Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company and the 2nd Battalion 106th Infantry, 7th Infantry Division were assigned to capture Majuro. To support all of these thrusts, there would be a massive assemblage of U.S. Navy ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and an astonishingly varied array of transports and landing craft. These warships provided a maximum potential for intensive pre-invasion aerial bombing and ship-to-shore bombardment. The increased tonnage and high explosives, the lengthened duration of the softening up process, and the pinpointing of priority enemy targets were all lessons sorely learned from the inadequate preparatory shelling which had contributed to the steep casualties of Tarawa. For the Marshals, there were altogether 380 ships carrying 85,000 men. With the plans in place and a very tight schedule to meet the D-Day deadline, the complex task of assembling and transporting the assault troops to the target area was put in motion. Readying the Army's 7th Division was the easiest part of the logistical plan. It was already in Hawaii after earlier operations at Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. The 22nd Marines, however, had to come from Samoa, where it had been on garrison duty for some 18 months, and the 4th Marine Division was still at Camp Pendleton in California, where it had recently been formed. On 13 January 1944, the division sailed from San Diego to commence the longest shore-to-shore amphibious operation in the history of warfare, 4,300 miles. Life at sea soon settled down into a regular routine. All hands soon became acquainted with the rituals of alerts for general quarters in the blackness of pre-dawn, mess lines stretching along the passageways, inspections and calisthenics on the cluttered decks, the loudspeaker with its shrill whistle of a bosun's pipe and its "now hear this" freshwater hours, and classes and weapons cleaning every day. Off duty, the men took advantage of the opportunity to sleep, play cards, stand in line for ice cream, write letters, and, of course, engage in endless speculation about the division's objective, which was originally known only by the intriguing title of burlesque and camouflage. On 21 January, the transports carrying the Marines anchored in Lahaina Roads off Maui, Hawaii, and visions of shore leave raced through the minds of all the men. Hula girls, surf swimming, cooling draughts in a local bar, just what was needed after the long nights in the crowded, humid troop compartments during the voyage. Over the ship's loudspeakers, sad to say, came a not unexpected announcement. There will be no liberty. After one day filled with conferences and briefings for the senior officers, the task force sailed again. Next stop, the Marshall Islands. En route, crossing the 180th meridian, there were the traditional, colorful ceremonies in which the old salts initiated the men who had never before crossed the international dateline into the domain of the Golden Dragon. On 30 January, the ships threaded their way through the eastern atolls of the Marshalls, and the following morning, dawn 31 January, they halted before their objectives, with the northern component off Roy Namur and the southern component facing Kwajalein Island. On every transport, the men crowded the ship's rails to stare at the low-lying islets which they must soon attack. The 23rd, 24th, and 25th Marines were assigned to the Roy Namur operation, and the 32nd, 17th, and 184th Infantry Regiments of the Army's 7th Division were to take the Kwajalein Island objectives. Meanwhile, the small group assigned to Majuro, 2nd Battalion, 106th Infantry, plus the 5 Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company, had split off from the main task force and would make its own landing on 31 January. Advance intelligence estimates of minimal enemy forces proved accurate. There were no American casualties and just one Japanese officer was captured on the main islet. 3 days later, more than 30 U.S. ships lay at anchor in the Majuro Lagoon. Forward at the main theater, an awesome pre-landing saturation bombardment, begun on 29 January, was in full swing. U.S. Navy ships moved in on Roy Namur, with some at the unprecedented short range of 1,900 yards, and poured in their point-blank massed fire. Continuing the repeated aerial strikes which had begun weeks earlier from the carriers, waves of planes swept in low for bombing and strafing runs. Key enemy artillery and blockhouse strongpoints had earlier been mapped from submarine and aerial reconnaissance, and individual attention was given to the destruction of each one. The combined total of shells and bombs reached a staggering 6,000 tons. As a result of the underwater obstacles and beach mines uncovered at Tarawa, for the first time Navy underwater demolition teams had been formed for future operations. Fortunately, they found no mines at Roy Namur and were not needed at Kwajalein. Another factor which would assist the assault troops was the configuration of the atoll. The two main objectives, at the north end and at the south, were each adjoined by islets, and these neighboring locations were to be seized on D-Day, 31 January, as bases to provide close-in artillery support for the infantry landing. On either side of Roy Namur, the 14th Marines would bring in its 75mm and 105mm howitzers and dig them in to support the main landing from islets which carried the exotic names of Enubing, Melu, Enubur, Enumenet, and Enugarit. As is always the case in war, there were problems. The task was assigned to the 25th Marines, and because of communications difficulties, the different units going ashore on different islets could not coordinate their landings. Their radios went dead from drenching sea swells that swept over the gunnels of the Amtraks, LVTs, landing vehicles tracked or amphibian tractors. Nevertheless, by nightfall, the beachheads had been secured, and for the first time, U.S. Marines had landed on a Japanese mandate. On board the transports outside the lagoon, the men of the 23rd and 24th Marines spent the afternoon of D-Day transferring to LSTs, landing ship's tank. That night saw a muddled picture of amphibian tractors stranded or out of gas inside the lagoon, with many others wandering in the blackout as they sought to find their own LST mothership. While this scramble was going on, the assault troops on board the LSTs were facing, each in his own way, the prospect of intensive combat on the following morning. One rifleman, Private First Class Robert F. Graff, remembered, "As I thought of the landing that I would be making on the morrow, I was both excited and anxious. Yes, I thought of death, but I wasn't afraid. Somehow I couldn't see myself as dead. Why wasn't there fear? I wondered. Even though I was nervous, it was with excitement, not fear. Instead, there was a thrill. I was headed for great adventure, where I had wanted to be. This was just an adventure. It was grown-up cowboys and Indians. It was grown-up cops and robbers. Thoughts of glory were in my mind that night. Now it was my turn to carry the flag into battle. It was my turn to be a part of history. To top it all off, I was going into battle with the elite of the elite, the United States Marines. Just prior to falling asleep, I prayed. My prayers were for courage, for my family, and I prayed to stay alive." By the next morning, D+1 February, the LSTs had moved inside the lagoon. Up before dawn, the infantrymen filed into the cavernous holds of the LSTs and clambered on board their amphibious tractors. Graff described his equipment. Landings were made with each person loaded with weight. We wore our dungarees, leggings, and boondockers, shoes. Our skivvies, underwear, had been dyed green while we were still in the States. White ones were too good a target. In addition, our packs were loaded with whatever gear we thought we would need, such as extra socks, toilet gear, poncho, and our D&K rations. Extra cigarettes were stuffed in also. Believe it or not, some of us carried books that we were reading. I wore 2 knives. The K-bar knife that was issued was tucked into my right legging. The throwing stiletto that I had purchased was on my belt. A leather thong at the bottom of the sheath was tied around my leg so that the knife would not flop around. My bayonet was in its sheath and attached to my pack. On went the loaded pack. Around my waist went the cartridge belt, fully loaded, with 10 clips of M1 rifle ammo, each clip holding 8 rounds. Over my shoulder were 2 bandoliers of M1 ammo, holding an additional 80 rounds. Hanging from my pockets were 4 hand grenades, only requiring a pulled pin to be activated. We donned our helmets with the brown camouflage covering. Finally, we slung our gas masks over our shoulders. Now we were ready for bear. Out of the deafening din of the ship's holds, eerily lit by red battle lamps, down the ramps of the unfolding bows, lurching into the rough seas whipped up by the wind, the columns of Amtrak's went to war. End of chapter 1.